So section 1.5 is on addition of real numbers. Okay, so we're going to look at adding integers, we're going to look at throwing in some variables, then we're going to look at adding fractions and decimals, and then we'll do some applications. For the first video, I think I'm going to combine topics 1 and 2 because topic 1 is super, super short. All right, so topic 1 is visualizing with a number line. So how do we add integers? Let's think about a number line first. So if you're adding a positive number, you move to the right of the number line. If you're adding a negative number, you move to the left of the number line. Combining positive and negative numbers, move in the direction of the number with the larger absolute value, okay? So let's see how this is going to work, all right? So we're going to add each pair of integers using a number line, for example, 1. So when I look at A, I'm going to start with my first number. I am at -9, all right? So I've got -9, but I want to add +5. So all I would do is I would move to the right 5 units, because remember, if you're adding a positive number, you move to the right. So I would move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 places to the right, and I would end up at -4. And that kind of makes sense. Think of temperature, for example. If the temperature is -9 degrees when you wake up in the morning, but it increases by 5 degrees by, let's say, lunchtime, the temperature would then be -4, okay? So let's look at example B. Example B is a little bit different. So for example B, I'm going to start at -4. So I'm going to start here at -4. And then I want to add -3. And if we go up here and look at this second bullet point, it says adding negative numbers, you want to move to the left on a number line. So from -4, I want to move to the left 1, 2, 3 places. And that puts me at -7. And again, that kind of makes sense. If the temperature is -4 degrees when you go to bed, and then by the time you wake up the next morning, it dropped an additional 3 degrees, you would be at -7 degrees. So hopefully this just kind of gives you a very gentle understanding visually of what we're doing when we're adding integers. Okay, now topic 2 is the rules for adding integers. Unfortunately, it's not realistic to always use a number line. If you get into 2, 3-digit numbers, a number line is no longer going to make sense, because imagine taking -584 and adding 276. Do you really want to start at -500 and whatever I said and then move it 200 in some places to the right? Of course not. So we need to have rules that we can follow when we're going to do things just by hand without a number line. So when you're adding integers, 2 things come up. You're either adding integers that have the same sign, or you're adding integers that have different signs, okay? So if you're adding integers that have the same sign, you add the absolute values and then keep whatever that common sign was. So if you're adding 2 negatives, add the numbers and then just keep it negative. If you're adding 2 positives, add the numbers and then keep it positive. Now, if you're adding 2 numbers with different signs, you subtract the smaller absolute value from the larger absolute value. And then you, whatever the result is going to be the sign of the number that had the larger absolute value. So I kind of like, when you start talking absolute value this, absolute value that, it can get a little confusing. But basically, if you're dealing with 2 numbers with different signs, forget the signs for just a second. The absolute value just kind of makes them positive. Subtract the 2 numbers naturally. And then at the end, whichever number had the larger absolute value, so again, kind of forgetting signs, what was the bigger, and then figure out what the sign for that number was, that's going to tell you the overall sign for your final answer. And I'll explain this a bit more in depth when we get into the examples, okay? So for example 1, or rather example 2, we want to find each sum. That just means add, okay? Now I've got -17 plus 26. So let's think temperature again. Let's say you go to bed and wake up in the morning and the temperature is -17 degrees. But by lunchtime, the temperature has risen by 26 degrees. What's the current temperature? Well, we can figure this out pretty easily. So we're dealing with different signs here. So technically, we take the absolute value of these numbers. So the absolute value of -17 is just 17. The absolute value of 26 is 26. I want to take 26 and subtract 17. Well, I have to do some borrowing, so this is going to kind of remind you of some of those old do math on paper kind of steps. I can't take 7 from 6, but I can borrow from the 2. 2 becomes a 1, 6 becomes a 16. 16 minus 7 is 9, and then 1 minus 1 is just 0. So 26 minus 17 is 9. But now the question is it positive or is it negative? Do I have more negative or do I have more positive? In this case, I have more positive. That means the number with the larger absolute value is 26. Since 26 was positive, my final answer is going to be positive 9. Okay? Now for part B, we have negative 316 plus 179. So again, we're dealing with addition of numbers with different signs. So what I do is I just kind of ignore the sign. That's the whole absolute value part. The absolute value of negative 316 is 316. The absolute value of 179 is 179. I want to subtract these two numbers. I want to find their difference. So same thing, I can't take 9 from 16, but I can borrow. So 1 becomes 0. 6 becomes 16. 16 minus 9 is 7. I can't take 7 from 0, so I borrow. 3 becomes 2. 1 becomes 10. 10 minus 7 is 3. And then 2 minus 1 is 1. So right now I know I'm dealing with 137. But the question is, am I dealing with positive 137 or negative 137? So I go back to my original numbers. Do I have more negative or do I have more positive? In this case, I have more negative. That means negative 316 had a larger absolute value than positive 179. So because I had more negative, that means my final answer is going to remain negative. So kind of think money here. Let's say you were overdrawn in your bank account and you had negative $316 in your account. You were able to deposit 179. That's great. You're still in the negative in your bank account. In fact, you're negative 137. Okay. So just find a way, real world, that kind of makes these sort of make sense for you until you just really get the hang of what you're doing. Okay. Now, finally, for part C, we have negative 126 plus negative 250. Here, we're adding two numbers that have the same sign. The directions say add the absolute values and keep the common sign. So again, I just kind of ignore the signs here and I add because the absolute value of negative 126 is positive 126. The absolute value of negative 250 is 250. So I add those numbers. So 250 plus 126, you could probably do this one in your head, but if you need to do the side work, that's fine. 0 plus 6 is 6. 5 plus 2 is 7. 2 plus 1 is 3. So I know I have 376, but am I positive or am I negative? Well, when you're adding two numbers with the same sign, you add them and you keep whatever the common sign is. So this is going to be negative 376. So basically I had negative and I added more negative to it, which makes me like extra negative. Okay. So make sure you understand those basic signs for adding integers. Now let's go ahead and look at example 3 here. So example 3 is almost the exact same thing as example 2, except now we've got three numbers and we threw in an x. The x is there just to be like, what? But remember, we already know how to simplify algebraic expressions. When we have an algebraic expression, meaning there's variables involved, you want to add or subtract the coefficients of like terms and then just keep whatever the variable is. If all of these terms have an x, they're all like terms. So they all have just an x to the first power. These are like terms. So what we can secretly do is think of it like this for now, and then just make sure in our final answer we tack on that x at the end. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add these kind of left to right. I'm going to add 2 by 2. That's one way you could do this. Another way you could do this is take all of the positive numbers and add those, take all of the negative numbers and add those, and then at the end add the number, the two different signs. I'm just going to go left to right though. So that means I'm going to add 5 and negative 12. Well, we're adding numbers with different signs. That means we subtract. So I want to take 12 minus 5, which is 7. But I have to determine if this is positive or if this is negative. Do I have more positive or do I have more negative? Well, I only have 5 positives, but I have 12 negatives. That means I have more negative. So this is going to be negative 7. And then I just want to drop down the next number in line, which is 2. So again, I'm adding two numbers with different signs. That means I subtract. So 7 minus 2 is 5. But again, do I have more negatives or do I have more positives? Here I have 7 negatives, but I only have 2 positives. Since I have more negatives, my final answer is going to be negative. So this is negative 5x. Just don't forget that x at the end. Okay? Same thing for part B. We can pretend, so again, this is going to be something with an x at the end. But for now, we can just pretend we have negative 4 plus 3 plus negative 5. Okay, just don't forget the x at the end. The x is still part of this problem. All right. Another way that you can do this, instead of just adding from left to right, you can add all of the positives or add all of the negatives. So let's say we regroup this and we said, okay, we have -4 plus -5 plus 3, okay? Well, we're going to go ahead at this point and add left to right because now we're just adding the two negatives. So when you add two numbers that are negative, you just add them and then keep it negative. So we add 4 and 5, which is 9, and since they were both negative, the 9 is also negative. Don't forget your plus 3. And now you're adding two numbers that have different signs. Remember, when you're adding numbers with different signs, you subtract. 9 minus 3 is 6. But again, do I have more negative or do I have more positive? In this case, I have 9 negatives. I only have 3 positives, so that means this is going to stay negative. So we get -6x. So make sure you kind of understand visually what's going on when you add integers, but especially understand those rules for adding two integers with the same sign versus adding two integers with the second sign. Make sure you practice this and understand how this works, because when we go to subtraction, you need to really understand addition first. Okay? So get your practice in before we go to the next video.